Bunch of cons. Bunch of cons. Bunch of cons. Bunch of cons.
I turn to the cost of living crisis, and I could say to you, and I will again, and it's no criticism at all of programmes where we've done this or where other people have done this. How bad is it? How is it hitting you? That is going to underpin a lot of the conversation that we have today. But I am quite interested in taking it apart and trying to put it back together again. I am quite interested in trying to, well, let's just hope the front wheel doesn't fall off and I'm wheeling all the way up to the 11 o'clock news. I am quite interested in taking it apart and trying to work out the stuff that's really confusing. There's nothing confusing, is there, about a cost of living crisis? It's Mr. McCorber territory. It's you've got more going out than you've got coming in. What's confusing is how the people in charge, the people in power in this country, can be so tin-eared about the unfolding crisis. I guess simplistic answers would include that they're not being as tin-eared as they appear. They've just got nothing else to say, so whatever it is that they say is going to end up sounding ridiculous. I'm drawn to Martin Lewis. You'll remember, quite a few of you already reminding me, Julie in Suffolk. The phrase he used was that he has no tools left. I've known Martin for years. I've known Martin for, God, crikey, I've known Martin sort of for 30 years. We weren't really buddies at college, but our paths crossed a couple of times. He was a very active student politician, not politically, but he was very into helping the university run better and doing things. I've never known Martin to be exercised like that. The only other time I've seen him emotional in that sense, he's quite an emotional fellow, I hope he doesn't mind me telling you that, but when his own face is used to sell scams on the internet, it drives him absolutely potty. It's a bit like that line in The Crucible about my good name. All you have left is your good name. And if someone tries to take away your good name, they're taking something that's very, very precious to you. And when people use Martin's face on the internet to sell scams, it drives him absolutely potty because they are really abusing his good name that he's spent his entire working life building up and having this reputation now as one of the, if not the most trusted human being in public life in this country. Actually, I don't say this very often. It's an honour to know him. It's a privilege to know the fella. And I've not known him to be as emotional as he's been in recent months about broader economic issues, using phrases like, I have no tools, the government have to act. What Martin has done, the money-saving expert, for anyone who doesn't know, I wonder whether Boris Johnson knows, given that Martin came to prominence on daytime television, and apparently it's a badge of honour in the current cabinet not to know who the major stars of daytime television are. But the alarm, Martin hit an alarm weeks ago to say, look, this is not like anything else we've ever dealt with before. This is absolutely bloody epic. He's a lot more articulate than I am. I'm sure he didn't swear. And then you look at Jack Monroe's work as well. If you see the two, Martin, of course, is by dint of the work that he does, is very, very wealthy. Jack remains not very, very wealthy, but more comfortable than they were when they started writing about cooking on a ridiculous budget, preparing food on an almost non-existent budget. And you look at those two positions, those two public advisors, you could call them almost, tribunes of the people, advocates for change, coming from completely different economic perspectives, but with very, very similar messages, and the message being, this is absolutely serious. Then you turn to the latest polling by Redfield and Wilson, which doesn't just find that 94% have been hit by the cost of living crisis. That's quite nebulous. And if you've raised your eyebrows at your energy bill, or I noticed this morning Sheila Fogarty commenting on how her council tax has rocketed, we've had that as well. I mean, you've been hit by it if you've noticed it. So that would be almost everybody, except people who perhaps don't even look at their own bills. But in terms of thinking, oh, well, we've now got to pay that, which means we can't do that. It depends what it is you can't do. Oh, we're going to have to go to Barbados for 2 weeks instead of 3 weeks. Or, you know, maybe we won't be able to have 6 Deliveroos this. Do you see what I mean? It's all relative. But when 72% say they've been affected significantly or a fair amount, that is uncharted water in my lifetime. Certainly in the time I've been doing this for a living, which is not far off half my lifetime. Good grief. Stop thinking things like that. It's untold. It's unheard of. Which makes the political response over the last 24 hours, to my mind, incredible. and incredible in the purest sense of the word, as in a sort of curious combination of staggering and unbelievable. It beggars belief, doesn't it? That Boris Johnson, yesterday morning, would have been fully cognizant of the fact that he was going to be asked about the cost of living crisis. You would imagine that even a vaguely competent back office at number 10 Downing Street would have prepared him to answer questions about the cost of living crisis. Inevitably, Susanna Reid, inevitably makes it sound like it was easy. She did an absolutely brilliant job yesterday, put pretty much every client journalist in the country to shame. I don't imagine she'll be getting another crack at Boris Johnson anytime soon. But she used an example of a British person, the kind of British person that Conservatives traditionally claim to care about. A law-abiding pensioner. Oh, yes. Oh, we really care about them. Down with refugees, up with pensioners. Why don't we look after our pensioners more instead of looking after all these refugees? Or single mothers, or, I don't know, unemployed people, or junior doctors, or firefighters, or teachers, or whoever it is you're supposed to be getting angry with today. Keir Starmer, I think, for having dinner. So she went in with a personal example, and the response of the Prime Minister was breathtaking. Even as a relatively committed chronicler of the catastrophic realities of being governed by a man who was propelled to power on the back of an enormous nation-damaging lie, even I found this incredible. I've been watching Boris Johnson quite closely since about 2008. Even I found this incredible. Have a little listen. Remind yourselves, refresh yourself of what happened yesterday when Susanna Reid introduced Elsie to the public conversation.
Elsie is 77. She's a widow and she's a pensioner who lives in a council house. She receives a pension of £170 a week. Her energy bills have gone, get this, from £17 a month to £85 a month.
Yeah.
She will pay an additional £816 a year. To cut down on spending, Prime Minister, Elsie has now resorted to eating one meal a day. She's 77 years old. She's losing weight. She goes to the supermarket at the end of the day to buy yellow sticker discounted items. She gets up early in the morning to use her Freedom bus pass to stay on buses all day to avoid using energy at home. What else should Elsie cut back on, in your opinion?
Well, I don't want Elsie to cut back on anything. Let's talk about Elsie and what we're doing. And just to remind you that the 24-hour Freedom bus pass was something that I actually introduced, just parenthetically.
Marvellous. So Elsie should be grateful to you for her bus pass. But what else should she cut back on?
There are plenty of things that we are doing. So what we want to do is make sure that we have people who are in particular hardship looked after by their councils. So we're putting much more money into local councils. We have the particular payments for to help elderly people, in particular, with the cost of heating. But look, Susanna,
she already qualifies for that.
And I'm going to accept.
I'm asking you now, what does Elsie cut back on now?
I don't want Elsie to have to cut back on anything, and we will make sure.
But Prime Minister, her energy bills have gone up to £85 a month.
And the best answer is to help her abate the cost of energy as we are, but also
through a loan that she has to pay back?
To make sure there's a direct cut in her council tax as a result of what we're doing, plus she
doesn't qualify for the council tax rebate as her home
plus the winter fuel allowance. There are measures that we put in place to help people, but I'm not going to pretend to you,
you can't say anything to help
I'm not going to pretend to no, because what we are doing is making sure that we take the steps now to invest in our energy supply. You get back to your point about the energy companies, to ensure that we have the supply for the medium and the long term.
But don't worry, because Environment Secretary George Eustice has got the answers.
Generally speaking, what people find is that by going for some of the sort of value brands rather than, own branded products, they can actually sort of contain and manage their household budget. But it will undoubtedly put a pressure on household budgets. And of course, it comes on top of those high gas prices as well.
It's 10:15. I don't know which of those two is worse, actually. That isn't going to be the phone-in, because George Eustice seems to think that he's offering up helpful advice. So you'll be sitting there now in your indoor coat, eating cold spaghetti hoops, having gone without dinner last night, or having the kids' leftovers, and you think, oh, God, thanks, George. Darling, do you know that supermarkets have value ranges? that are cheaper. Stop buying Tesco finest scallops in breadcrumb sauce. All right, breadcrumb sauce isn't a thing. Stop buying Tesco finest scallops and top of the range lasagna. We've got to start buying the value stuff. Crikey, tell Grandma we're coming to visit this weekend. We can fill the car with petrol after all. Tesco value products, you say? Ex-UKIP member George Eustace. Value. Whoa, tell me more about these value products of which you speak. Or is it Boris Johnson who's not even pretending to give a monkeys about things? I've been somewhat overtaken by events here. I didn't realise that first clip was so long. I did, but I kind of forgot. So I'm going to frame the question for you after this, but it is going to be, actually come in early if you want, but I just need to share a few more of my thoughts with you first. Unless you ring in without me needing to share. In fact, how attractive an invitation is that? Ring in now before you know what the question is, and I won't inflict any more of my thoughts upon you. But how can you be that out of touch? Even if you've got billions of pounds in the bank, it's not hard to imagine what it's like to have nothing. Is it? How can they be that out of touch? Are they really that out of touch? And how do you achieve psychologically that level of disconnection from the basic reality of huge swathes of the country that you profess to govern? I do want to explain a little more on this, because, you know, you think about the 4% or the 6% who have not been touched, if you like, or have not been hit by the cost of living crisis. And you know, you wonder whether perhaps you're in that 6%, given that you're not required to make any swinging change. Although I'm turning into my dad when it comes to lights and heat in the house. Turn it off, do I look like the electricity board? But how can anybody not understand? That's the question I've got for you. I said I wanted to take the story apart in order to understand it. It's not going to be in the first instance a conversation about how tough things are for you, because I know how tough things are for you. I know Benny, when he writes, use own value brands. I've been living on the value stuff for years. The biggest inflation on shopping I can see is on value items, 15 to 50% increases on the value items, not on the big brands. I don't know, but the idea that you can look at the cost of living crisis and think, oh, well, they should just eat cheaper food is, I mean, it's Marie Antoinette in its arrogance and ignorance, isn't it? And he's the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. He's the head of food, if you want to break it down, in this country. George Eustace, ex-UKIP, the head of food. And he says, if you're struggling to pay your food bills, have you thought of buying cheaper food? And I don't know how, maybe you don't either, but this is where I want to start. How can you be so detached from reality? How, when told about a 77-year-old woman sitting on a bus all day in order to keep warm, how can Boris Johnson return with such a crass and arrogant response? Also one that doesn't really stand up to proper fact-checking. That's it. It's psychological. Remove the politics from it if you want. I think you'd struggle to find people who lean towards the left who have no grasp whatsoever of what it's like to be poor, even if they're rich, because that's one of the tactics they use, isn't it? Well, you've got a few quid, you're out of touch as well. That's just thick. I'm really sorry, but that's just thick. And it's not so much the fact that you think the people listening to you are thick, it's the suspicion that you are that thick yourself, if you're going to swallow that idea. Oh, if you've got some money, then you can't possibly understand what it's like to be. But of course you can. All you've got to do is close your eyes. Imagine, I told you at the weekend, got a puncture on the way home and thought to myself, what if I didn't have 100 quid? What the hell would I do? Who would I ring? I mean, to be fair, if I didn't have 100 quid, I wouldn't have been 100 miles from home, would I, given the price of fuel at the moment? But it's not hard to do. Martin Lewis is minted. He sold his company for tens of millions of pounds. No one doubts for a nanosecond that he's got a bead right into the experiences of the people he speaks to and speaks for every day. There is absolutely no obstacle to empathy created by wealth or privilege, perhaps by a lack of intelligence in George Eustace's case, but Boris Johnson is supposed to be clever. So psychologically, how can these people be so utterly removed from the reality of your life? Or, if like me, you're not in this constituency of pain, how can they be so removed from the reality that is so obvious to the rest of us? Peter is in Peterhead. Peter, what would you like to say? What do you reckon, Peter?
Let them eat cake. That's what I would say.
It is a bit, isn't it? I mean...
It is. It's not a bit. It is. Marie Antoinette, so detached. Peasants come to the gates looking for food. They want bread. She says, let them eat cake.
Like, she gets told they've run out of bread, and her world is so insulated and so cosseted that she presumes if you've run out of bread, well, then you must go and get the cake.
Absolutely. How can Richie Sunak have any concept of what hardship's like with 400 million quid?
No, I don't. Do you know, maybe I'm trying to defend the indefensible here, but I don't buy that, mate, because of Martin Lewis is worth 100 million quid or more, and he's got a full concept. He dedicates his life still to trying to help people who haven't got a pot to pee in.
So is it ignorance? Just put it down to ignorance.
Well, I think it's willful. They must be closing their eyes deliberately. You can forgive people for not... Oddly, Marie Antoinette would perhaps be someone you could forgive for simply not knowing what's going on outside her window.
Yeah.
But to be the Secretary of State for food... and to think that people who are struggling to pay their food bills are unaware of value ranges. I don't have the words to describe that, Peter, and that's my job.
No, me neither. The Elsie, she should be grateful that she can get on a bus to heat herself through the day. It just beggars belief. That man comes onto his platform and he took Peppa Pig and go on a bus and free. Just every time he opens his mouth, he digs a bigger hole for himself. The question is, if you don't mind me talking over you,
sure.
who do I vote for?
Oh, well, careful. I'm always a little bit wary on this one because there are, of course, elections tomorrow, and I always err on the side of caution with election rules, Peter, because my Ofcom ruling many, many moons ago happened precisely because I wasn't fully across what I am and I'm not allowed to say on the radio in a period. It's not an election actually today. But, yeah, I mean, you're in Scotland in particular, which adds a whole new complexion to the problem. But let's say very broadly that you're looking for someone who appears to understand the scale of the cost of living crisis and perhaps even has a solution to it or at least an alleviation of it.
That person doesn't exist. The options are available. Do I choose to be shot or stabbed? Because the outcome's the same. And that's who do I vote for?
I'm not sure I would agree with you on that, but I can't argue with where you are. I mean, the most obvious short answer to this is the windfall tax that Labour have been punting for years, but which the Conservatives continue to resist. I mean, somewhat inconveniently for Boris Johnson, BP itself has undermined his argument against a windfall tax, saying it would go ahead with investment in Britain even if a levy were imposed. So we're back to the psychological. Boris Johnson stands up and says, we can't possibly have a windfall tax, folks. Dulce et decorum est, cogito ergo sum. We can't possibly have a windfall tax, folks, because BP wouldn't invest in this country if we did. BP come forward and say, yeah, actually, we would. Back to the Prime Minister. Oh, no, let's not talk about that. Let's, talk about Keir Starmer having dinner. If it wasn't so transparent, it would be funny, wouldn't it? Mick's in Ipswich. Mick, it's the psychology of it. And at risk of pot kettle black accusations, I don't want to hear well-worn criticisms of, quotes, Tories, end quotes, because some of them understand what it's like to be struggling. Some of them understand what it's like to be skint. The two we've chosen, Boris Johnson and George Eustace, at this point in this country, how can they be so utterly detached from observable reality?
Well, morning, James.
Hello.
I did say to your researcher, the one word that says it for me is they're Tories. And
I've just literally said I don't want to do that.
No, I know you did, but I'm just saying how I came on it.
Okay.
And I said what it is, they are hyper stuck on what they believe. And so
Boris Johnson doesn't really believe anything, Mick. He wrote two columns about leaving the European Union.
I think they sort of believe in...
Sunak perhaps does.
Their ideology. And so, again, as I said to your researcher, nobody seems to have picked up on the fact that they're saying they're going to give people help via councils. And so when it all goes wrong, as you have said and lots of other people have said, they will turn round just like they do when...
Mick, I'm very interested in what you have to say, but this is not the phone-in that I'm currently conducting. But what is the psychological flaw or indeed gift that allows anybody, regardless of their politics or their ideology, to not even be on the same planet, let alone the same page, as people who currently can't feed their families?
Is it that they don't have a genuine personal fear of losing? Are they?
But I don't.
don't know what George
You don't. Most people listening to this programme are not actually going to struggle to feed their families. They're going to have to cut their cloth accordingly. They're going to have to make savings. They're going to have to make changes. They're going to feel the pinch. And they can all understand what it would be like. They can all achieve empathy.
But like you, I can't see why they can't come up with an answer to get more money.
Well, with the greatest of respect, you're supposed to ring in with the answers.
I have got an answer.
Go on,
Is
then.
that they can make more money? National insurance is only paid up to a salary of, I think, about £50,000. So why not make national insurance paid on your salary?
Could be,
whatever it
yeah.
might be?
I mean, except, of course, people earning more than £50,000 are going to be feeling a variety of pinch at the moment and taking money away from them to help the people being pinched even harder is going to be controversial, both electorally and economically. The bleak answer might be that there aren't any solutions to this, or there aren't any big solutions to this, just lots and lots of little ones. But you're not going to find the little solutions, are you, if you're unaware of the problem? So think about this again, all right? Because, we spend a lot of time together, and sometimes perhaps I fade into background noise, which is absolutely fine. I fully appreciate that. But occasionally I do feel the need to sort of slap you around the chops with a wet kipper, because what is happening under our noses, not in Ukraine, not on the other side of the world, not in terms of, climate catastrophe ticking slowly towards us, but in terms of what's happening on our watch, in our time, to our people, under our noses. Secretary of State for Environment, Rural Affairs and Food, thinks that if you're struggling to pay your food bills, it's because you're not aware of value ranges in supermarkets. Happens occasionally, this. I have to actually say it out loud to you for the sheer weight of the problem to hit me properly. That's unbelievable, isn't it? As ever on the programme, at the moment you'll struggle to get through, but we'll soon fix that. If you want to mount a defence of George Eustice and say, I think he's absolutely right, the reason why people are struggling to pay their food bills is because they don't know that cheaper food exists, then I'd bite your arm off, or I'd say I'd bite your arm off. So George Eustice would probably suggest that as a cure to hunger. I don't want to give him ideas. Susanna Reid, of course, who conducted that interview with Boris Johnson, shaming interview, I think it's fair to say, even if you're tugging your forelock so hard your eyes are on stalks this morning, you must acknowledge that being told about a woman who can't afford to stay warm, so she stays on a bus all day, responding by that, saying, well, I have bus passes. It's beyond pathetic. She spoke to Andrew Marr last night on LBC and told him, of course, that she has spoken to Elsie since that interview, and she was, to say the least, or rather as a mistress of understatement, disappointed by the Prime Minister's answer to her plight. 77-year-old widow. They're the ones you care about, right? Yeah. 10:35 is the time. I'm perhaps this is a bit self-indulgent of me. Maybe this isn't the thing that interests you the most, but rest assured we will not take our eyes off the reality of the cost of living crisis for people. But I am fascinated by the psychology, if that's the right word, of people like George Eustice. You remember when you learnt about Marie Antoinette in school and you couldn't quite get your head around it, but you knew that the gilded cages in which the French royal family lived were so far removed from the reality of the ordinary people that you could just about get an idea. This was a world without television, a world without mass communication, a world without internet or radio. God, imagine a world without radio. Actually, don't. It's too terrifying. What would you do between 10 and 1 every day? But you could say, gosh, that Marie Antoinette, she must have been so removed from reality that she actually thought that when poor people run out of bread, they don't have to go hungry because they can eat cake. It's probably apocryphal. It's too pat, isn't it? It's too neat, too tidy. And I think the literal translation is actually brioche, like sweet bread, rather than cake itself. So you run out of baguettes. Why can't they eat brioche? I think that is exactly what George Eustice just did. Perhaps to be fair, you can you don't have to mount a spirited defence of George Eustice. You can just challenge my suggestion suggesting that if they can't afford to eat at the moment, then all they need to do is buy cheaper food. You can challenge my suggestion. That's every bit as crass, as obnoxious and as arrogant as what Marie Antoinette said. And she went down in history as being the poster girl. I think she got her head chopped off as a consequence of being so out of touch with the reality of existence for ordinary people. And George Eustice has just mounted a kind of pound shop tribute act. The mind boggles, it truly does. So how can you be that removed? How? I stumbled across a local history month yesterday, and I was reading about the Victorian philanthropists who would build schools or hospitals. Now, my politics suggests that they should have been paying more tax, but they still knew that the kids needed hospitals, they needed schools. You can be mega rich and still conscious of how poor people are, and your own moral compass might lead you in one direction, or you might choose to pretend that you don't care. But if you're in government, why would you want to go into politics if not to help the people who need help most? Why? So what goes on in what passes for the minds of these people? I think we'll leave the hearts out of it. Boris Johnson talking about bus passes, and George Eustice talking about value ranges of food. There was another one on Channel 4 last night. Krishnan Gurumurthy did a brilliant debate, a studio-based debate with 4 politicians in front of an audience. And I tuned in a little late, and there was a woman on, I think probably from the Conservative Party, who started recommending websites that people can go to in order to help make savings. You know? And while many of these websites are brilliant, the idea that that's a meaningful contribution to the cost of living crisis at this point in it genuinely beggars belief. Sophie's in Woodford. Sophie, what would you like to say?
I've been on both sides of the fence.
Oh, yes.
I went to a very good school. I had a very good job. I presented programs for television. I did very well. Then, due to personal circumstances, I've now ended up on the other side of the fence.
Okay.
And when I say the other side of the fence, I don't think when you're earning money and you give money to somebody selling The Big Issue, I was on charity committees raising money, you still don't appreciate it. You cannot appreciate what it's like. I have days I can't put any fuel in my car. I can't drive my car anyway because I can't pay the insurance. I can't pay the tax for the car. You talk about food, buying value food. It isn't a choice of whether you buy value food. It's a choice of whether you can buy food at all. I haven't had heating for 4 years, probably, because we can't afford it. It's oil heating. Yes. We can't afford it. So you get black mould in the house. We have a window broken. We can't replace the pane of glass. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. I don't think you can appreciate that, you know, when you owe money like council tax, bailiffs turn up, you own, you know, you get letters all the time, but you haven't got the money.
I know exactly what you're saying. I think if we had to pick a word, we'd probably pick relentlessness, would we? It's the relentlessness of it that you have to...
It is. Yes. It really is. It's constant. And you can't see a way out of it. There is no way out of it. You think, and you hear the politicians, and I mean, I used to mix with politicians, and I know that some of them, you know, they go into it, and I'm sure they all go into it with a great, you know, they're going to change the world and everything else. But they don't. I don't believe, my personal opinion is, unless you've felt it and been in that situation, you can't appreciate it.
But there's gradations. There's gradations of appreciation. So I'm not going to argue with you about this because obviously your experiences give you an insight into your reality that nobody who hasn't been through it could ever fully share or fully appreciate. But there are gradations of appreciation. I can empathise. I can imagine. I could without any instruction, guidance, or help, I would know that the last thing, the stupidest thing, the meanest, nastiest, most obnoxious thing I could say to you would be, have you thought about buying cheaper food? So I guess I'm interested in the extremity of the crassness. How because you're probably right. However much you give to charity, however much you care, however much you volunteer at food banks, however much you do this stuff, unless you're living with the relentless grind of poverty. You just don't know. You will never know what it is like. But I do think that comments like Johnson's yesterday and Eustace's today and the woman on Channel 4 News yesterday, they're a different level of detachment. They're a different level of non-appreciation. And I wonder, given your perhaps close to unique perspective of your life experiences, do you understand how anyone... I'm going to phrase this quite basely, Sophie. Do you understand how anyone can be as stupid as George Eustace?
Strangely enough, I probably can.
Go on.
When I was, in my previous life...
In your pomp.
In my pomp, yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. In my pomp, I thought... I just... that
Go
people
on.
didn't help themselves.
Right.
Actually,
Yeah.
that sounds awful.
No, it does, but it doesn't. It doesn't.
And that...
There must be some form of personal responsibility. If things are that tough for you, it must be because you haven't worked hard enough, or you haven't tried hard enough, or you haven't...
Yeah, exactly. And that there was no way that anybody was living... of course you can buy food.
Yeah.
Don't smoke, don't drink. It was always that sort
Get rid of your flat screen television.
Yeah.
That kind of rhetoric.
And it sounds, I'm ashamed that I ever thought that way. I wasn't on my own, trust me.
No, of course you weren't. There's an awful lot of effort put into persuading people to think that way. Many of them used to ring this radio programme.
Yeah, and a lot of people think that way. And then something can happen. It can happen to all of us, Every single one of us. It doesn't matter who we are or what we've achieved, it can happen. Yeah. Something can happen that changes your life so amazingly quickly that you suddenly get what reality, what a lot of people in this country are living like. And there's a lot of people living like myself.
More than ever before. And then some people even worse off than you, and some people marginally better off. I mean, you have a car. You might not be able to drive it, so it's naff all use to anybody, but there'll be some people who could only dream of being able to afford a car.
Exactly.
It's still not enough, though, is it? Because I mean, I can understand a sort of casual carelessness that you describe, and I'm not trying to patronise you, but I mean, the effort that is put into persuading people that poverty is a lifestyle choice is absolutely immense. It was very common on this radio station when I started working here for presenters to suggest that anybody struggling should stop smoking and drinking and watching flat screen televisions. I think that worldview is in retreat at the moment, but how can it end up at the heart of government? I mean, what do they think is happening?
So many of the people who actually hold the power. Sounds so bad. They have no experience of what it's like. They really don't.
But nor do a lot of the politicians who would address immediately questions of poverty and cost of living, or politicians who went into politics in order to help those with the least, rather than to describe them as feckless work-shy layabouts who are entirely responsible for their own privations. It's just so odd to me. Why would George Eustace want to be a politician if he doesn't even know what being poor means?
Because I think they think they're doing well. They think what they do is good. Yeah. But they don't get the actual what really needs to be done. Saying things like, we advise you to buy value food.
Or have you tried the internet? Have you looked on the internet to find, have we got broadband or Wi-Fi?
Yeah, or go to, you could go to this charity or that charity and they can help you, possibly, But the fact of the matter is that people like Elsie are, it's not a choice. Oh yeah, I'll go and buy, value food. It's her choice is she's probably buying value food and can only eat once a day, and that is a lot of people's now. That's the reality.
And the likelihood of that reality being ameliorated or in any way improved shrinks according to how conscious politicians are of it. Sophie, that can't have been an easy call for you to make. I'm very grateful that you did. It perhaps helps people plot their own moral course on these sort of issues. The first-hand knowledge of how you can shift from thinking that people in your position are somehow feckless or responsible for their own plight, to being in that position and knowing full well that you're not, is, I mean, if it's nothing else, it's illuminating. And I do hope things get better for you, and I am conscious of how pathetic those words sound. But it's better than suggesting that you buy cheaper food. It's not just us who are reeling from George Eustace's comments this morning. He's not a politician that I know a lot about, except the fact that he used to be in UKIP, which is probably all you do need to know about him, like Priti Patel's dad. But how? How does this happen? And I may have missed some tricks. It's not obvious. I don't think anyone is claiming it's obvious. It's not one of those mornings where I'm getting my medicine for being a little bit slow on the uptake. I am a little bit loath to go down the obvious routes, but perhaps that's just a problem I've got, because I do this every day and sometimes the obvious routes just get boring. So Maeve's under no illusions. She says it's their core beliefs. They've had the empathy bred out of them. Eustace and Johnson literally can't imagine another person's experience, and certainly not one which is alien to them. It's the ultimate othering of people who are not them, least of all Elsie. It is obviously toxic. Gabrielle suggests that it's a sort of male superiority, male dominance idea, although she may actually be responding to a different tweet that I put out earlier showing a ridiculous article Boris Johnson published that was written by Michael Gove. More on that later if there's time. Steve, back to the evidence. I've been working at a food bank for the last 3 years. The need for our services increases year on year. More requests for fuel vouchers. I'll tell you now, the crisis is affecting so many people in all sorts of situations. But this psychological inability or refusal to recognise reality. This one from Beware False Prophets. It's the paternalistic and patronising mogism of it, the dispensing free advice to the serfs that allows them to avoid thinking deeply about an issue. I mean, it's not to give him a break, as it were, but let's not forget that until relatively recently it was a well-worn tabloid trope to suggest that anybody who was struggling through their own faults. It was their own failure to get a better job or failure to stop smoking or stop drinking or stop watching their flat screen. You remember this. It was an almost daily refrain at one point in Britain, particularly oddly after the financial crisis, when the idea of blaming the people responsible for it gave a fit of the vapours to client journalists, and they started coming out with lines about how important it was that you don't blame the bankers, which opened the door to austerity, which is of course a political ideology built upon the idea that the global financial banking crisis in 2008 was caused by there being too many libraries in Wolverhampton. That's a Lexi Sales joke, not mine. So it's all of a piece. So actually, the more you think about it, the more George Eustace and Boris Johnson are just children of Rupert Murdoch, aren't they? The despicable Rupert Murdoch-flavoured rhetoric of blaming and othering at every turn. If you're poor, it's your fault. If you need help, it's your fault. You don't need help. There is no such thing as society, whatever it might be. And you put that through the sausage mincer, and out comes George Eustace and Boris Johnson, maybe. I don't know. But we've all been alive at the same time as them, and we haven't ended up as morally broken as they appear to be. I guess actually Sophie's reminded me of the importance of asking, did you used to be like this? 0345 6060973. Perhaps you can give us a better insight into how it happens. Do you know people like this? I mean, I don't think I suppose professionally I do, but that's why I don't do TV shows anymore, in case I end up sitting next to one of them and having to pretend that it's all just a game and it's all very polite and we all go out for a meal afterwards. Stuff that for a game of soldiers. I think these people are vampires. I think they're ghouls. But in your real life, as it were, did you used to be like this? Would you once have said, well, why don't they just eat value food? Or mange en brioche? Or why wouldn't you have just sort of moved to a smaller house or sold your car? There's no such thing as poverty. Part of it, psychologically, is the old Steinbeck line about there being no such thing as poverty in Dust Bowl era America, just temporarily frustrated millionaires. That explains how the punters go along with it, how ordinary people continue to vote against their own interests because they may one day end up being the beneficiaries of a grossly unfair society. So I understand that. But, you know, I went to public school. I mentioned that quite often. It's funny because if I don't mention it, then I get accused of keeping it from you and somehow denying my privilege. And if I do mention it, I get accused of boasting. And I'm not getting my violin out. I'm just pointing out how desperate these people are to silence any valid criticism, particularly criticism from privilege. The people who have benefited from an unequal system are kryptonite to the inadequates who would be nowhere near where they are in life if our starts were even vaguely equal. Jacob Rees-Mogg in a Stone Island shell suit with a Mitchell Brothers accent. What do you think he'd be doing for a living right now? Yeah, exactly. So how do they end up believing or failing? I just don't get it. Here is a woman. Here is a 77-year-old widow travelling on yeah, whatever, don't care. By the way, I introduced the bus passes. Here are people struggling to eat. Have they thought of trying value food? Are you aware that there are some websites where you can find advice on how to make your food go further? They're not detached from reality, says Sam. They just don't care. But it's more than that. I am going to labour this point. Because it's more than that. They don't care, that's fine, but they don't know, which is worse, I think. So did you used to be like this? Hand on heart, like Sophie, which is a very brave call, tough call. Did you honestly used to believe the crap, forgive my French, about flat-screen televisions and 20 Rothmans? 0345 6060973. I would love you to tell me what made the penny drop, what changed it for you. Because then perhaps we come to a better understanding of how George Eustice and Boris Johnson, despite being in charge respectively of food, farming and the environment and the entire blooming country, can still apparently subscribe to a school of thought that allows poverty to be seen as the fault of the poor. So did what changed for you? How did you break out of the George Eustice mindset that if you can't afford to eat, it's because you're not aware of cheaper food in the supermarket that you go to? How did you break out of that? Or are you perhaps still in it? Or do you know someone who is? A bit like when we talked about vaccine deniers or QAnon supporters. And speaking to the people down the rabbit hole it's a bit of a spectator sport. It's a bit like the Colosseum in Rome or when you used to be able to visit Bedlam as a tourist. It's a bit like mocking the afflicted, laughing at the vulnerable. Whereas when you speak to the family members of the people down the rabbit hole, it became a much more interesting conversation. Is your mother-in-law a George Eustice? Why? I don't just want the what of it, I want the why of it. Rob's in Tring. Rob, what made you pick up the phone?
Hey, morning, James. I hope I've been worth waiting for. I think both Boris and George
yes.
have... I think Sophie put a finger on it when she said they have a lack of experience. And also, I think they come from...
So do most people listening to this programme have no experience of what we're talking about.
But if I asked you what was the price of a pint of milk, would you be able to tell me? You know, I don't suppose George would be able to, for example.
But why does that matter even? I mean, again, that's the kind of rhetoric that used to go alongside talking about flat screen televisions and all that. Does it matter? You don't have to know how much a pint of milk is to know what it's like not to be able to afford. Well, yeah, of course it might help, but the question is, what is it like not to be able to afford a pint of milk? The question is not how much does a pint... Actually, I am going to disagree with you on that. I think that's precisely the sort of lazy journalism that helped create the myth that there was a kind of... I don't know, an explanation for poverty. And here is a politician. I remember when David Cameron answered a question about bread by saying he made his own, and Rishi Sunak answered one recently. It shows that they're out of touch, but you can still... I might have 10 different types of bread in my larder. I can still imagine what it's like not to have any.
Okay. But they obviously don't have all of the answers, and I think we're all responsible for ourselves. You know, I remember back in the 70s when the interest rates went up to something like 15%. I just moved house and I didn't have a penny to my name, and all of a sudden I had to take the shirt off my back as well. And I survived by doing other things, not because the government helped me, because I helped myself. And right. I got off my backside, and I did things. Also, James, you're sitting there in your nice warm office,
And come the winter, you'll still be sitting in your nice warm office there, and Elsie and people like me won't be. So what do? Well, like Elsie, I jump on the bus and I go to shopping.
Sorry,
malls
just in
and I
a
keep
sentence,
warm.
Rob. What have you rung in? What point have you rung in to make?
Well, you were asking a question. You were asking the question about Elsie, about
No,
Boris.
I asked a question about how these two politicians who are in charge of pretty much everything relevant to the conversation we're having can be utterly unaware of the reality.
Well, I'm not sure they are, but I don't think.
So you think that
you
think that people struggling to pay their food bills, Rob, are unaware of cheaper food?
No, I don't.
So how can George Eustace think that?
Clearly, George doesn't know.
Why are you calling him by his first name, mate? He wouldn't cross the road to wee on you if you were on fire.
All right, George Eustace.
How can he not know? How can he think that people who are struggling to pay their food bills are unaware of cheaper food?
Because he comes from a point of ignorance. Because he doesn't have that experience.
But he thinks they should just get off their backsides and look after themselves, doesn't he? Like you do.
Well, yeah, you know.
Next time you ring in, Rob. Next time you ring in, mate. Get your thoughts in order before you get on air, would you?
Oh, James.
Roadkill could be the answer. Maybe George Eustace will suggest that next. I don't know about you. I was in Norfolk at the weekend, and my goodness me, there are an awful lot of carcasses littering the roadside. Why can't poor people eat roadkill? Perhaps he might. What else would you come up with next? Well, they should buy cheaper. And funny though it might be to speculate in those sort of realms, I can't get past this. I'm quite surprised by how much of a... What's the word I'm looking for? I'm quite surprised by how stubborn it is in my brain, this thought. The relationship between the fact that they're in charge and the fact that they don't know what they're in charge of. There it is. Well, that's a new record. An hour and 18 minutes. They don't know what they're in charge of. They're in charge of a country where people can't afford food. Remember the story last month about food banks, where people didn't want potatoes anymore because they couldn't afford the energy to boil them. They're in charge of a country where a growing number of people are struggling to feed themselves, and they think it might be because they're unaware of cheaper food. I don't know how you even frame that in an economy as advanced as ours, in a country in a city where I'm broadcasting from, where these people live and work. I don't get it. I don't get it, and possibly I never will. Julie is in Buckhurst Hill. Julie, what's going on?
So yesterday I was in the supermarket and I was looking for some lettuce. So I was wandering past and you've got the box of all the reduced stuff.
Yeah.
I thought there's nothing in there. But I saw a couple looking at the food and kind of, umming and ahhing and everything. And I said, you don't have to come here. You can go to local food hub. And they didn't even know that it existed. And I said, you don't need a referral. You don't need to jump through any hoops.
I thought you did. I thought you needed to.
You don't need to. No, you don't need to.
Okay.
No, those food banks you do. Those food banks.
I see. There's different.
The Trussell Trust has got a religious, coming from a church kind of ethos. But there's other food banks that you can go to. And the one that I help out at when I can, they actually run across the district every day of the week. And basically I told them that you can go there and you've got everything. You've got food. It's good food. They've got clothes. They've got shoes. They've got really everything, and their faces just lit up, and I get emotional.
I know you do, and you did a good thing. It's quite a bold intervention to make in the supermarket, Julie.
I know it is, and I'm not. It's part of my job. I'll say that, my voluntary job. It's part of my voluntary job.
Oh, okay. So you were speaking of what you know. You were.
I'm speaking of what I know.
Right.
Yeah. So, and I thought no, and I know that I feel like I'm a good judge of character. So I would have immediately apologised.
And how do you? I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking about people who were weighing up the wisdom of buying stuff that was
you can
already
see that they were spending too long. They weren't just saying, "Oh, hey, look, that's £1, that's this, let's go. No, they were thinking about it, and they were so grateful.
Yes.
And I said, no, you don't need to be grateful. You aren't grateful. The food at the food hub is, it's all going to be probably going to landfill. But look, the landfill is going to be, they charge to put food in a landfill. So this is donated by companies all over the place that are going to have to pay to put that food in there. So you're doing them a favour. You're doing the country a favour to stop this going into landfill. But you don't need to go, you don't need to jump through the hoop. You lose your job on a Friday. You really can't. You've got nothing in your cupboard. You do not have to go. You should not have to go and jump through the hoop. But
I understand the point. I understand the point you're making. And it's quite nuanced, actually, given the basic nature of the conversation.
Can I just?
Of course you can. Carry on. But I do want to ask you one question. Carry on.
Yeah, one other little thing is it's a big thing. I think it's the biggest one across Essex now.
Yeah.
But the thing was when it was like trying to get opened, and it was like one of the initial things from a few people was, and I had to argue for it. I was very irate about it.
Yeah.
Was their first question was, so they haven't got to jump through a hoop. So are they going to be taking advantage of it?
Yes.
And I said, well, look, obviously, because where there's anything that is being given for free or that is needed, there'll be people trying to cheat the system. But
one of them will be a Daily Mail journalist.
And surely you are not going to let all these genuinely, desperate people suffer just because you're going to have to protect this little bit of whatever. And that's that very.
Well, that's an interesting answer to the broader question, isn't it? Because you're trying to work out how people can be so ignorant. And it was the Mail on Sunday that eight years ago sent a journalist to a food bank trying to prove, actually it sent 3 reporters, I think, or one of them went there and the other 2 worked on the story, trying to prove that the Trussell Trust had failed to run proper checks on people claiming food parcels, and therefore to argue that it had been abused by scroungers. And that is actually part of the process, the bigger process we're discussing, the sort of gaslighting, if you like, of a nation into thinking there's no such thing as... You find one fraudster, one person swinging the lead, and you can somehow turn around to your congregation and claim that nobody is actually in need.
Well, they would be up the wall about an actual thing where you lose your job on a Friday and you can go on a Monday to get free food. They would be outraged by that. But I would think it's absolutely immoral. If you're going to have the guts to walk into a food bank and ask for something that you desperately... I'm getting upset again. Something you desperately need, then you should really be having it. I mean, why should we be trying to protect food and then let it just go to pay for it to go to a landfill? It's obscene.
What is your answer to
landfill.
No, I get that, and that's your mission, clearly, and it's a noble one. What is your answer to the question of how 2 politicians in such positions of power? It's not as if they've just turned up last week and been given the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom cannot really know that people like the ones you encountered in the supermarket yesterday even exist.
Yeah, they don't need to. It's for them. They don't need to, because I think.
But how can they not know?
No, it's the poor. Yeah, they choose not to know. It's the poor. There's the deserving poor, I think, and the undeserving poor.
Right.
And if you look back in the way that the country works, you've got Charles Dickens, and you've got Tiny Tim. You've got they're the deserving poor, and the church. The who inherits the earth? The meek inherit the earth. And as long as you're seen to be,
slow down a bit. Sorry, just slow down a bit. Only because I'm struggling to keep up.
I've been sitting waiting to talk to you.
I can tell you got it. Well, at least you had a fairly clear idea of what you were going to say when you got on the radio. Let's hope that catches on. It's not simple, but so they don't care. And no, I can't come with you on this because they're in charge. I can see how the bloke over there writing a column for the Daily Mail doesn't care, or the woman over there who is just detached from it all doesn't care. But how can they not care? He's in charge of farming. He's in charge of food. How can he not?
Yeah, no, they've not. It's just not joined up thinking that they do. They don't need to think about those people The deserving poor, yeah, we can think about those. We'll just do enough for them.
But they're not even doing
really,
that.
In the great scheme of things, the people are not important enough. I don't think that you could say they're not their core voters. They're not their core importance. They do not have only unless they get a really big light shone on the obscenity of it. But the obscenity of it, like Ukraine, is on everybody's iPhone, iPad. We see the absolute disgusting nature of the whole thing. If you saw somebody sleeping on the street or somebody living in such disgusting, damp circumstances, looking in their cupboard, these are real people.
Yes.
And really, really, and if we really, really saw that, I mean, the nearest you could get to it is that daft program, which isn't to the extreme, it's all kind of clean, which is the swapping lives. You've got a wealthy person swapping with a relatively poor person, but even then that's all sanitized. They're not swapping with Elsie, are they?
But I mean, we all walk past homeless people and very few of us change our lives to help them. Very few.
But they know it exists.
And if you were in charge, you'd put it on your list. You'd put it on your to-do list at least, wouldn't you? Even if you concluded that the poor will always be with us, as these ghouls.
Yeah, you don't need to have the poor we've got now. Not with all that food that's going to landfill. You just do not need it.
I understand why this is I think it would be patronising to call it a hobby horse. So I'm going to stick with mission. I understand why. No, I really do. Oddly, I mentioned earlier that I'm turning into my dad with the heating and the lights at home and being very conscious of that. But also the amount of food that families throw away is
and also, another thing just about the food.
You'd need your own show, Julie.
Yeah, I do. The quality of the food, right, is actually the food that is available for people to be slim and healthy is useless food. And it just, they spend more on the advertising of it than of the ingredients. And this, even the way I've got so many things, even the way COVID has been handled with the food, you cannot, there's a food industry which is the government supports. They support the businesses and the industry. They don't support the food that's produced and the health of the people that have to eat it.
No, it's business. The relationship between food and nutrition is it broke a long time ago. But we'll talk again, I'm sure, Julie, because you clearly know a heck of a lot more about the attendant issues here than I do. The one that, is it fascinate the right word? Just the idea of how the politicians can be so utterly removed from the reality. A few of you are sending me a clip of myself. That's always a good idea. That's always guaranteed to get my attention. Talking about Andrew Rossendale. Do you remember him? He talked about how... you almost struggle to believe this. So I'm looking, but I've got two things on my screen, actually. One is that story, which I just thought I'd check. 3 Mail on Sunday reporters revealed that Britain's biggest food bank provider, the Trussell Trust, had failed to run proper checks on people claiming food parcels. Let's think about that. Looking at the date, I think the fellow who was news editor then is now editor of the Mail on Sunday. Let's think about that meeting. That editorial meeting. What we're going to do, there's a lot of stories about food banks. What I want you to do, right, I want you to go to a food bank and I want you to come back with a story that it's all a load of old rollicks and no one really... Well, we can't really... So you go in there, you try and get some food, you beg for some food, don't do any checks, and if you get some food, we've got a brilliant story about how food banks aren't actually checking on whether or not people are hungry enough. And Julie rings in 8 years later to actually, in a sense, give a well-deserved kicking to the fact that food banks run checks at all. Because although some people will always swing the lead, the idea that the price you pay for helping people who really need help is helping a few people who perhaps don't need help seems relatively logical. Do you know what else? It seems pretty close to Christian. So that's story number one I've got in front of me. 8 years ago, the Mail on Sunday... astonishing. A 2-page article about food banks. A special investigation under the headline, No ID, No Checks, and Vouchers for Sob Stories. The truth behind those shock food bank claims. The truth behind those shock food bank claims is somehow revealed by sending a lying journalist to a food bank to beg for food and succeed. Oh, down with that sort of thing. So that's perhaps... item of evidence number one for the prosecution of George Eustice. He's the kind of person that reads things like that and thinks food banks are the problem, not the Daily Mail or not the Mail on Sunday. And the other one is that clip of Andrew Rossendale, which I'm going to have to play to you, because otherwise I don't think you'll believe me. And it was only last November when he was justifying the removal of £20 a week from universal credit recipients, by definition the poorest people, the poorest families in this country. But resisting calls for MPs to face a ban on second jobs because they are human beings with families. The mind actually boggles. I've been banned. Can you believe this? I thought I was in charge of this programme. I've been banned from playing a clip of myself on the grounds that it is excessively egotistical, which on reflection is possibly true. It was Andrew Rosindell, who I think has a constituency in Essex, who simultaneously argued that people on universal credit didn't really need the 20 quid a week they got, despite being, by definition, the poorest families in the country, while MPs on, 80, 90 grand a year? And I'm not a passionate opponent of second jobs for MPs, actually. It depends what it is. I don't think that you should be able to fly to the Caribbean to put in months as a lawyer while Parliament is at least in session. But equally, if David Lammy wants to do my holiday cover for a few days a year or present a show on Saturdays when Parliament is not sitting, then that seems to me to be absolutely fine. Or if you want to write a newspaper article or a book, you want to ban politicians from writing books. So there are lines to be drawn on that. But Andrew Rosindell furiously opposed to the idea of MPs being banned from second jobs on the grounds that they are human beings with families, whereas the poorest families in the country, facing a £20 reduction in their universal credit, voted through by the Conservative government, probably don't need it. That's the search that's underway today. And it may be a little bit naive of me. It may be that the answers are blindingly obvious. But as I said at the outset, it's about taking something to pieces so that you understand how to put it back together again. And I guess naively I thought, and still think, or hope, it's the hope that gets you, isn't it? The despair I can cope with. We might be able to change people like George Eustice and Boris Johnson if you could work out how they ended up being where they are. Does that sound silly to you? In many ways, that's what my last book was about. But the idea, I mean, like Sophie just saying, I used to be one of these people. I used to think it was somehow their fault. And now it's hitting so many people, the cost of living crisis, you simply can't sustain that position. So when you're presented with evidence of it, as Boris Johnson was yesterday, how can you be so tin-eared? How can you be so crass when you're in charge? And how can the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs think that people who are struggling to feed themselves, struggling to afford food, are unaware of cheaper food? Huh? It's the internal dialogue. You're in a studio, which can be quite nerve-wracking, but you think they'd be used to it. You're asked a question that you must have seen coming. What advice have you got for people like Elsie, or what advice have you got for people struggling? And, I mean, had you thought before you went into the studio, I know, I'll tell them that there's cheaper food available. I think Eustace's contribution is worse than Johnson's, isn't it? Because Johnson's was bumbling and buffoonish, and we don't buy that shtick anymore, but Eustace seemed to think this was a valid response to a pertinent question. There's people over there who are really struggling to afford food, George Eustace. Any thoughts for them? Any advice for them? Well, yes, they should buy cheaper food. They should buy cheaper food. James is in Exeter. James, what's going on?
Hello, James. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for having me on.
We'll see.
I really enjoyed your last caller.
She was great, wasn't she?
The undeserving poor.
Yes.
Yeah, she was wonderful. Shades of George Bernard Shaw there.
And the ragged-trousered philanthropist as well, I think, as well.
Indeed. I can't believe there's any ignorance here. I know you've talked about how tin-eared Boris Johnson sounded in that interview yesterday, and George Eustice. I don't believe there's any ignorance there. You remember the way he closed that interview by asking, who's Lorraine?
Yeah.
To Johnson, ignorance is something that it's a tool. It's not a weapon. It's something that can be used for political gain. It can be, forgiven, ignorance. Not that I'm suggesting I forgive the way he responded.
No.
Or it can be turned to your advantage. It can be humorous, and, that's how Johnson
tried, but failed, didn't he, yesterday? It doesn't always fail, of course.
Absolutely, because there's only so far you can push a joke.
Yeah. Carry on. Sorry, I was about to interrupt you.
No, of course. What I got from that interview when he was asked, when he was confronted with the reality of the cost of living crisis, when he was told the story of Elsie having to ride the bus, his response, and George Eustace's response as well, suggesting we get value brands, as though that's something the poor haven't considered. These were responses born out of fear, and there was fear in Boris Johnson's eyes. You could see it. And fear, unlike ignorance, it isn't something that can be used for
fear
political
of what?
gain. Fear of being confronted with the inevitable consequences of one's actions. That sounds a little vague, but I think with this government in particular, you need to bear in mind that this is nothing that they've ever had to deal with before. It's not a can that can be kicked down the road. It's not something that can be postponed and put off because, your last caller mentions, the homeless have always been with us.
Yes.
There have always been homeless people on the streets, but, they're no longer the vagrant living, on the street. The poverty, the cost of living crisis is...
It can be people who are outwardly comfortably off, or they're living in nice-looking houses, but there's nothing in their fridge, there's nothing in their cupboards. So fear of responsibility, really, is what you're describing.
Fear of responsibility, and fear specifically of the inevitability of that resposability coming
So the
true.
stupidest question I've asked today is, why did they go into politics? They went into politics because they just thought that was the sort of job commensurate with their self-image and status. It had nothing to do with the people that they would ostensibly be governing, and everything to do with their self-image.
Well, I wonder if it's... Yeah, well, yes. Maybe...
Did Boris Johnson seek to become Prime Minister in order to help people, or in order to claim his place in the history books? I don't think even his admirers would answer the former, would they? If he's got any left.
I think that question answers itself. Yeah. You're quite right. I just think it's because, the consequences for Johnson so far have been so abstract. Have been so abstract, and I say that with absolutely no disregard to the consequences of COVID. But COVID was something that could be addressed through simple, soundingly simple measures. Wear a face mask. We're working on a vaccine. Hands, face. But this isn't something that can be addressed with a 3-word slogan.
Yes, I think you'll find it can. Buy cheaper food.
Try me.
Buy cheaper food.
Buy cheaper food.
Get Brexit done. Buy cheaper food.
Once people say, "I'm doing that," what then?
Well, then we'll put David Frost in the House of Lords and get him to explain why you're not doing that at all, even though the evidence of your eyes and ears supports the notion that you are doing that. Here's old Frosty to actually claim that black is white, up is down, and the moon is made of cheese.
And all that has worked for them in the past. But this is something that's now it's not something that will change. It's not something people will forget when the news cycle changes. It's not a dead cat.
It can't, can it? I heard one farmer today saying for the next 18 months, and I did want to ask where the 18 months figure came from, because that's sort of light at the end of the tunnel territory, and I don't know where that confidence came from, but it's certainly not going anywhere anytime soon, and more people are going to be suffering. And I know I kind of thank you, James. I perhaps laboured this point, but the psychology of consuming it, not just actually stating it, not just selling it, the psychology of consuming it. We're a weird old bunch, aren't we? We really are. I mean, how many families are divided along issues like this, I wonder? How many people are actually hearing this conversation and thinking of family members who just refuse to recognise? And I'm not excusing them. You know my catchphrase, contempt for the con men, compassion for the con. But if you've been reading newspaper articles for years portraying... you do remember, don't you? I'm not going mad when flat-screen televisions were dropping off the lips of right-wing columnists pretty much every 10 minutes, all about flat-screen television. Don't blame the bankers, flat-screen televisions. I do find myself thinking, maybe we should be grateful that so many people can see through the cant. 11:43 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I met someone the other day who I thought you'd like to listen to, just a really good professor of war studies who I thought could give us a really good overview of the continuing crisis in Ukraine. So we'll do that next. Last word probably on this for today, but not forever. He's going to go to Charlie, who's in Bexhill. Charlie, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, I just thought it was really interesting because I can kind of understand where these politicians are coming from, but I can also see the other side of the coin, which is, ironically, both my parents grew up on council estates and worked their way up.
Right.
They sent me to private school. I had all of the beautiful things. I had the pony, all the rest of it.
Gosh.
And I ended up with what I'd call an empathy bypass. Say, I went to this lovely school, I speak in a certain way, and I actually then went on to do a degree in politics and history to go into politics. And I can tell you, doing the good thing for the people was never my priority.
What was your priority? I applaud your honesty.
That's right. It was just to get a high-end job where I could turn around and say to everybody, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I get that. I think I was a bit like that, at sort of 17, 18, probably.
Absolutely. It was all about turning around to the other kids that I grew up with at the school and say, oh, look, I ended up in Whitehall, I'm working here, I'm doing that.
What changed? What changed?
Losing everything.
Oh, gosh.
So I do think that for these people that have come through this system of the education, the entitlement, you are going to get a job with a high sort of salary and everyone's going to look at you, until you lose that, you have no idea.
It's so odd, that, isn't it? Because I've been relatively privileged. I never had a pony. But I've spent my whole life wondering about what happens when the wheels fall off. I've been constantly aware. Martin Amis calls it tramp angst. And the fear that however good things are, one day you're going to wake up on a park bench. So it's just, I don't know whether it's biological or nurture or nature. You never had that until you did lose everything. I haven't lost everything. I've had that all my life. How odd is that?
Enough.
Yeah.
I mean, even the stories that my parents told me of, my father always jokes that he lived in ultra squalor.
Yeah.
Like
the Monty Python sketch.
Anything. Yeah. It was like awful. There was icicles.
Never crossed your mind?
Windows. No. Why would it?
And then the wheels did come off. I don't want to pry unduly, but then
that's all right.
And the wheels did come off.
It was the best thing that could ever happen.
Oh, good.
Because you then have to become humble, and you end up seeing yourself, and you can see yourself for the potentially revolting, vile, elitist creature that you were. And I think this is where these people are.
And it's a bleak conclusion then, because if you haven't got it by the time you become a cabinet member, then nothing that happens to you as a cabinet member is going to change you. The only thing that could ever change you is if you suddenly lost everything, or you suddenly had to be Elsie, or you suddenly had to be someone who can't afford to feed their family.
I mean, ironically, if Johnson lost everything and was fired or had to resign, it would probably be the best thing that could ever happen to him.
He's never going
to
lose everything, is he? I don't think. There'll always be someone there to pick up the pieces. Probably someone Russian. Charlie, thank you. I'm moving on only because I'm late for the break, and the guest I've got next is someone I want to have a proper swing at. But the conversation will no doubt continue. I mean, there it is. You're never going to get it. You're never going to get it until it's real. So it's almost like a lack of imagination, a failure of imagination. And I'll leave you with that question. Why do you think Boris Johnson went into politics? To make your life better, or to make his life better? Yeah. Answers on a postcard, please.
Bunch of cons. Bunch of cons. Bunch of cons.